The German media dubbed him the Pink Giant and the Beast of Billits, but his real name was Wolfgang Schmidt. Between 1989 and 1991, he stalked the forests and villages of Brandenburg, driven by perverse urges he could not control. As his impulses grew darker, he was finding victims almost daily. What set Schmidt apart wasn't just the brutality, but how sordid and twisted his crimes really were. This case reminds me a lot of the Ed Gein story, but in parts he is even darker than Ed and certainly more prolific. But like with many German cases I cover, there are no actual images of the victims, and images in general for this case are scarce, so you will have to bear with me. But I can assure you, this is a crazy one. But before we dive in, if you find this video fascinating, then please drop it a like and leave me a comment below. And if you are new here, then please hit the subscribe button and consider following me on Instagram. It all really helps. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse or condone the criminal actions described within. Wolfgang Schmidt was born on the 5th of October 1966 in the small town of Leinen near Potsdam, East Germany. He grew up in a rural area just outside the town with his mother, father and younger brother. His parents constantly argued and were both very cold to the young Schmidt. He had a particularly bad relationship with his mother, who's shown him no love at all. It was at age 7 that his physical desires began to emerge. It may not have been a fetish by this point, but it was certainly where it began. Schmidt went into his parents' bedroom where he found his mother's lingerie. He put it on, and Schmidt would later confess that at this point he felt pleasure, but it was innocent. He enjoyed it so much he did it again and again over the coming weeks. Psychologists have later theorized that this was a way for him to form a bond with his mother, a way to create a connection with her and fill the emotional void between them. Schmidt became obsessed with putting on his mother's knickers and bras, and eventually his mother caught him. But the thing is, it made him feel good, and he did not understand why his mother was scolding him so harshly for doing so. This, though, just made him want to do it more. By his early teens, he had begun using his mother's lingerie for more sordid activities. He began to defecate, urinate, and vomit in them, and then he would use them to pleasure himself. When his mother found out what he was doing, she began to lock her clothes away so he could no longer get to them, and he was severely punished and ridiculed by his mother, and beaten with a belt by his father. But by now, it was too late. Something inside him had been awoke, and he could no longer stop. It is believed he got a form of pleasure and excitement by destroying something that belonged to her, by taking control. At this point, maybe psychiatric care could have helped him. I mean, defecating in your mother's underwear for pleasure at such a young age is not a healthy sign. But instead of treatment, Schmidt's parents chose punishment, and his desires did not fade, they grew stronger. He often took rubbish from the house to local dump sites in the forest with his father. There, he noticed discarded women's clothing. Later, he would return alone, dig it up, and use it for his rituals. He did the same things to these clothes that he once did to his mother's, only this time he pushed it further. Schmidt began defiling the underwear, wearing it inside out after soiling it, and pleasuring himself with his genitals rubbing on the feces. Psychologists would later identify this as coprophilia, a disturbing fixation on human waste. For Schmidt, it wasn't just a habit anymore, it became a need. But like all obsessions, it escalated. Collecting lingerie was no longer enough. He decided he needed a woman to take part. Someone submissive, someone who wouldn't resist. But living in a remote village, his chances were slim, and so his mind turned to darker possibilities. If he couldn't find someone willing, he would have to take it by force. Not long before his 18th birthday, his father abandoned the family, leaving Schmidt and his brother in the care of their cold, distant mother. Now, with even more time alone, his fantasies festered. He drank heavily and withdrew into himself, but in public, he kept up appearances. To neighbours, he seemed shy, even pleasant. No one saw the brooding killer he was becoming. In 1985, after finishing school, Schmidt enlisted for 10 years of service with the riot police. Around this time, he met a young woman from a nearby village and fell in love. She had no idea about his secret desires, and this was the beginning of his double life. On the surface, things looked stable. Soon, the couple were engaged, and Schmidt seemed to settle into a routine. For a few years, he managed to contain his impulses, but in secret, nothing had changed. He was still scavenging women's clothing from rubbish heaps, now even stealing from washing lines, and carrying out his rituals in private. Maybe the discipline of the job and the comfort of a relationship held him together for a short while, but that control didn't last. In April 1989, it all came undone. Drunk, Schmidt publicly voiced extreme political beliefs. The consequences were severe. He was dismissed from the police force with immediate effect. Schmidt sank deep into depression. The police job had given him structure and authority, but now it was gone. He unraveled. He scraped by on odd jobs and kept up his relationship, but inside, he was falling apart. His urges only grew. He still stole women's underwear from washing lines and dug it out of rubbish dumps, but that no longer fed his desires. At 23, he found steady work in a steel factory. On the morning of October 24th, 1989, while cycling to work, he felt the urge to hunt for underwear. He stopped at the edge of a forest near the village of Droitz and noticed a small row of houses, and on the last house, he seen a washing line. As he crept around the back, a middle-aged woman, 51-year-old Adeltraud Nickstroff, was tending to tulips. Something snapped. Schmidt would later admit he felt an uncontrollable desire to subdue her. So he went inside the shed and grabbed a hammer and a piece of rope. He then approached her from behind. She saw him and tried to fight him with a rake. She managed to scream once, but then he struck her over the head with the hammer until she fell to the ground unconscious. He dragged her into the house and strangled her to death. Then he forced himself on her remains. But this wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to perform acts of coprophilia, but he felt it was not safe to stay in the house. But before he left, he went upstairs and ransacked the bedroom, throwing clothes on the floor and taking some of her bras and underwear. Once done, he was ready to leave, so he wrapped her body in a blanket and carried her remains to the forest. But before he could properly act, he was seen carrying the victim by passers-by, and they shouted at him in the forest, asking what he was doing. Realizing he was close to being caught, Schmidt fled. The plan had failed, but the rush he felt stayed with him. He hadn't meant to kill that day, yet the experience exhilarated him. Already, he was thinking about how he might do it again. When officers arrived, they first assumed it was a robbery gone wrong. They found blood spatter on the walls inside the house, and the bedroom had been ransacked. It looked like an intruder had broken in, been caught by Adeltraud, and killed her in a panic. But soon, the grisly details told a darker story. Adeltraud's skull had been caved in. This was a brutal attack. Her remains showed she had been forced upon after death, and scattered around her remains in the forest was women's lingerie. These details made no sense. If this had been a simple robbery, why risk carrying the body out in broad daylight? Why ransack her bedroom, yet take nothing of value? Detectives quickly realised they were dealing with something far more sinister. Whoever had done this was very dangerous and almost certain to strike again. They did have one solid lead, a footprint left in the garden. They also had a rough witness description from the passerby who said he was tall, athletic, and with blonde hair. The boot print, though, was their strongest clue. It turned out to be military-issued footwear, the kind used by police units. Investigators now believed the killer could be one of their own. If they could match the boot to an officer, then they could catch him. And fortunately, every boot issued was recorded to the person who received it. But 1989 was a chaotic time in Germany. The German Democratic Republic was collapsing. Systems were in turmoil, and records were impossible to track down. The list of names they needed never came. With weeks passing, the trail was going cold. Schmidt was free and ready to kill again. The devastation of Schmidt's first crime didn't end with Addertrold. In 1990, her husband, broken by grief, ended everything. Even this second tragic death wasn't enough to push authorities closer to catching the killer. He was still out there and still hunting. On May 29, 1990, Schmidt would strike again. He was cycling to meet some friends in the small village of Fursch, where he's seen a sign pointing to a landfill. Of course, his urges got the better of him, and he decided to stop off there on the way. At the landfill, Schmidt had soiled some underwear and was wearing them inside out as he did, whilst pleasuring himself. As this was going on, he was disturbed by a noise. 55-year-old Kirsten Nior, who was living in a caravan next to the landfill, had spotted him and shouted, "What are you doing?" She tried to chase him away, but Schmidt felt slighted. He was embarrassed that he had been spotted doing this, and now he felt she had to die. He flew into a rage, took off the underwear, and ran towards her. Kirsten screamed as Schmidt put her in a headlock, but Kirsten managed to break free and ran. But this time, Schmidt chased her again, picking up a discarded electrical cable along the way. This time, he dragged her to the ground and strangled her to death with the cable. He then dragged her lifeless body into the forest and forced himself on it. From this moment on, there was no turning back for Schmidt. He had learned that forcing himself on dead bodies brought him great pleasure. Now he knew he was about to escalate his crimes. The first two murders had been unplanned and spontaneous, but from now on he would hunt women. It didn't matter her age or what she looked like. For him, they were faceless. They just had to be female. Although the authorities hadn't yet linked the first two murders, Schmidt knew they would soon be onto him, but he didn't care. Now when he left his home, he was prepared to kill. He left his home wearing a camouflage jacket, carrying binoculars, rope, and a knife. Underneath his jacket, he would be wearing women's underwear and a leather apron to avoid getting blood on him. Now he was prepared, and his bloodlust was growing. Schmidt's first murder came in 1989, his second in May 1990, but it was his third attempt in July that year that things became truly premeditated. On the 9th of July 1990, Schmidt was at the rubbish dump, pleasuring himself as he often did, when he noticed a woman walking by. She was 58 years old. This time, he was prepared. Armed with a so-called murder kit, he approached her without hesitation. Then, he stabbed her in the stomach with the knife. She collapsed, screaming in agony, but she was still alive. Schmidt dragged her deeper into the forest, ready to finish what he had started and fulfill his twisted fantasy. But fate intervened. Another couple nearby heard her desperate screams and rushed to help. Before they arrived, Schmidt bolted, vanishing into the woods. The woman would survive her injuries and make a full recovery, though she couldn't give police a clear description of her attacker. Once again, there was no official connection made to Schmidt's earlier murders. Shaken by how close he came to being caught, he decided to lay low. For the next 8 months, the so-called pink giant kept his impulses simmering under the surface, waiting patiently for the next time he could strike. On the evening of March 13th, 1990, 34-year-old Inga Fischer was walking home after visiting a friend. Alone in the forest, she was suddenly attacked by Schmidt. He came up from behind and stabbed her in the back with a knife. Once she collapsed, Schmidt viciously and repeatedly kicked her in the face before dragging her unconscious body deeper into the woods to a spot he had already prepared. There, he stabbed her until she died. But this wasn't the end of his cruelty. He defecated on her and smeared it all over her body and face before forcing himself on her. Absolutely vile. Her body wasn't discovered until a week later, on March 21st. It was one of the most disturbing crime scenes investigators had ever seen. When they arrived, they noticed details that began to connect the cases. All 3 murder victims had been forced upon after death. Around Inga's remains, they found women's lingerie that clearly didn't belong to her, including a pair of bright pink knickers, alongside adult magazines and women's clothing catalogues. It looked like the killer had deliberately buried them there in advance. By this point, there had been 3 murders and 1 attempted killing in a relatively short span of time, all within a quiet rural area. Police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, yet desperate to avoid national panic, authorities didn't go public. Instead, they quietly circulated flyers warning locals not to walk alone. But that decision would have dire consequences. A nearby settlement of Russian military families never received the warning. Language barriers and their isolation from the local community left them in the dark. Just 9 days later, that missed communication would lead to another horrific tragedy. On March 22nd, 1990, 44-year-old Tamara Petrovskaya was walking home through the forest, pushing her 3-month-old son in a pram. Schmidt approached them and started beating Tamara, punching her to the ground. Once there, he began to drag her deeper into the forest. But as he was doing so, he noticed a problem. Her son was crying in the pram, so Schmidt dealt with this in the most horrific way possible. He picked up the youth by the legs and smashed his skull against a tree before kicking him violently in the stomach. The only small mercy was that the youth likely died instantly, spared prolonged suffering. Now can you imagine the sheer terror Tamara must have felt watching this happen? When Schmidt made his way back to her, she was gagged with her own underwear, strangled with a bra and forced upon after death. Her body was discovered the following day after her husband, a military doctor, reported her missing. At the crime scene, investigators immediately recognized the chilling similarities to the murder of Inga Fischer just days earlier. The presence of pink lingerie that clearly didn't belong to the victim and other women's clothing was scattered nearby, along with adult magazines buried around the site. Police were now certain they were hunting the same killer. Amongst themselves, they began referring to him as the Beast of Belize. The media soon caught wind of the case and they dubbed him Pink Giant. The murders dominated national headlines, with police offering a reward of 1,500 Deutschmark for information leading to his arrest. Despite tips flooding in and 48 officers working on the case, Schmidt remained free. His double life, a steady factory job, a fiancé, and a normal social circle made him look like the last person capable of such atrocities. Police scoured the forests of Brandenburg and soon uncovered grim evidence of where the killer had been. Hidden amongst the trees were bin bags stuffed with women's clothing and adult materials, much of which had been used to pleasure himself. Schmidt knew investigators were closing in, but his impulses were now completely out of control. There was no way he was stopping now. Just 2 weeks after his attack on Tamara, Schmidt was on the hunt again for more victims. He was wearing his leather apron and a bra and knickers underneath. He hid in some bushes near a footpath in the forest, waiting for the right time to strike. Then he notices two 12-year-old females walking down the path alone. Again, this is another escalation of his crimes. He's now considering taking 2 victims at once, and this time they were youths. But as I said earlier, age or appearance didn't matter to him, so long as they were female. As they passed, Schmidt leapt from the bushes, a towering man in an apron and lingerie, a sight terrifying enough on its own. But he instantly went on the attack. He grabbed one of the youths and stabbed another, but they fought back, and one of them managed to escape and run away. As one of them ran, he decided to let the other one go as well, maybe conceding defeat because he could not grab them both. The youths both survived the attack, and when the authorities heard what had happened, they swarmed the area, thinking he may still be lurking around, but he had again escaped. This time though, the two 12-year-olds gave a detailed description of their attacker, and they had a good composite sketch of him. The very next day, it was on the front page of all the national newspapers. The award for information had now risen to 6,000 Deutschmark, a considerable sum at the time. You would think, with his composite sketch bearing his likeness on all the national papers, it would make him lay low. But he was beyond this now. He was on a rampage, and now out of control. His impulses had completely taken over, and the very next day he would strike again, in the nearby town of Fitchenwald. On April 5th, 1991, Schmidt broke into the home of 66-year-old Talita Bremer. She had taken sleeping pills that evening and was in a heavy sleep, completely unaware of the danger lurking inside her home. Schmidt crept through her home freely, eventually making his way into her bedroom. There, he began going through her wardrobe, pulling out her underwear, scattering it across the room, and becoming aroused as he handled it. When the urge overcame him, he climbed onto her bed and strangled her as she slept. Once she was dead, he forced himself on her body. When investigators arrived, they noticed no money or valuables had been taken, confirming that this was no burglary. Schmidt's motive was never theft, it was gratification, fulfilling his own dark desires. By now, the people of Brandenburg lived in constant fear. Women refused to leave their homes alone, and parents kept their youths away from school. The entire community was on edge. The pressure on the police to stop the so-called pink giant was greater than ever. Despite the police having a composite sketch that looked eerily similar to Schmidt, no one ever thought to put his name forward. He wasn't even considered a suspect. Instead, investigators rounded up a handful of other men, but each one turned out to be innocent. Meanwhile, Schmidt was hiding in plain sight. Perhaps feeling the growing tension, or maybe simply biding his time, he paused his killing spree. On the surface, he appeared to have settled into the role of a hard-working man. By now, he was working as a fruit picker and preparing for the birth of his own youth. To those around him, he was just another quiet, reliable figure in the community. But underneath, the impulses that had driven him to commit such brutal crimes hadn't gone away. They were only waiting for the chance to erupt again. By this point, police knew they needed to set a trap. They had already discovered hidden spots in the forest where the killer left women's clothing and adult magazines to fuel his disturbing rituals. So they stationed officers near those sites, hoping to catch him in the act. But weeks went by with no sign of the culprit. Then, on August 1st, 1991, a stroke of luck changed everything. A local man called Mike Plain was jogging through the forest when he stumbled upon a tent pitched deep among the trees. Scattered around it were piles of women's clothing. Knowing a serial killer with such a fetish was on the loose, Mike immediately became suspicious. But he didn't approach alone. Instead, he returned with a friend and his van, and together they decided to go check it out. A bold move that put them both in real danger. When they got close, they saw adult magazines scattered on the ground. Inside the tent was a tall man dressed in women's clothing and pink boots. It was unmistakable. They had just come face to face with the pink giant. Thinking quickly, Mike kept his cool. He pretended to be from the Forestry Commission, telling Schmidt he wasn't allowed to camp there and that he had made a mess. He told him that it needed sorting out and that he had to come back to the van with him. Amazingly, Schmidt believed the story, or perhaps deep down he was finally ready to be caught. He agreed to follow the men back to their van. Without resistance, the two men drove him straight to the police station and handed him over. After years of terror, Wolfgang Schmidt, the pink giant, had finally been caught. When interrogated, Schmidt appeared shy and almost timid, far from the monster they had expected. He answered questions directly, admitting his involvement in the attacks, without playing any mind games or telling any lies. Yet, what was most disturbing was his complete lack of remorse. He wasn't proud of what he had done, but he wasn't ashamed either. To him, these acts were simply a way of fulfilling his urges. The only thing that seemed to truly embarrass him was how the press focused on his gender fluidity and his unusual fetishes. On October 20th, 1992, Wolfgang Schmidt, just 26 years old, went on trial. The Beast of Blitz was about to face justice, and the media frenzy was so overwhelming that not even all the press could fit inside the courtroom. Although Schmidt had already confessed to his crimes, in court he insisted he had never actually killed anyone. In his fantasies, he claimed the women were still alive and willingly participated. He even denied remembering the brutal murder of Tamara's 3-month-old son. Psychiatrists testified that Schmidt was a deeply disturbed individual with extreme deviance and likely a severe personality disorder. In his mind, his victims had to remain alive, as this was the only way he could achieve pleasure. The court determined that he was criminally insane and that he had diminished responsibility for his crimes. When presented with the composite sketch of the killer, Schmidt stared at it and simply said, "That looks like me, but it can't be me. I never killed anyone." Schmidt was ultimately found guilty of 6 murders and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, instead of serving his time in a standard facility, he was committed to a secure psychiatric clinic where he remains to this very day. While confined, photos emerged of him dressed in women's clothing, with images of men pinned to the walls of his cell. Despite the disturbing crimes of his past, reports from inside the clinic describe him as generally well behaved. Through years of psychiatric treatment, Schmidt came to understand and accept that he had, in fact, murdered his victims. In later reflections, he admitted, "I still have those urges. I am still a threat and should never be released." In 1997, Schmidt told a reporter that they now identified as a woman. 4 years later, in 2001, the courts granted this request and the name was legally changed to Biet Schmidt. And by 2009, Biet had begun hormone treatment as part of transitioning. Reflecting on the changes, Beata said, "My greatest pride right now is my breasts. I have an A cup, but they will grow a little. My beard has stopped growing. The only thing I'm missing is a gender change. The other inmates are unpleasant to me. They tell me I have a fat bum, and that hurts. I cry a lot every day, but it helps. I feel more feminine inside. I don't get any visitors. My father last visited me in 1995 and promised to come back. I am disappointed in my family. Other patients have also done bad things, but their families are always with them. I blame my mother for never trying to help me. Despite personal changes, the courts denied Biet's request for gender reassignment surgery. In 2010, Schmidt was back in the headlines once again. This time, controversy erupted when it was revealed that the convicted killer had been granted supervised day release. Many were outraged that someone responsible for such brutal crimes could be allowed even a taste of freedom. Yet, after more than 3 decades behind bars, certain privileges were extended. This case is not for the faint of heart. I've never heard the term coprophilia before, and I wouldn't mind if I never do again. This was a rough one. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.